The night the ship asked for help was quieter than the prayers that had failed Ethan Cole for years. He saw it fall like a secret, like someone dropping a lamp into tall grass, and he walked toward it because walking had always been the only answer he trusted. He was 38, an auto mechanic from Pecos Valley, New Mexico, hands calloused from belts and bearings, eyes used to the cold reflection of metal. The claim I make now is simple and enormous at once. I was not chosen for faith. I was chosen because I could fix things, and because I did not expect miracles to be neat. This is not a sermon. This is a confession and a record and a promise that you will see evidence that will rearrange what you thought you knew about Jesus and about how truth arrives. I warn you now, this truth will be both pure light and a shadow against what you hold dear. If you are ready to let a single new fact shift the foundation beneath you, then keep watching and listen all the way through. Ethan Cole, 38, greasy shirt and stubborn jaw, is the person who held the pieces. Now I will tell you how it began that evening on the mesa, when a craft hummed a note that made the dogs stop barking and made fish in a distant irrigation canal rise and spin. Now I will tell you how he decided to bring it home. On the first night, the field smelled of ozone and old leather and rain before the clouds had come. The ship was half sunk in scrub, its hull a living skin of metal that was not quite cold. Ethan remembered the sound first, because it was wrong against the usual night sound, a long, thin bell that made hair on the back of the neck stand up. He crouched close enough to smell it, and found the surface warm like a living animal, a scent like metal and citrus and something floral that no plant in New Mexico should make. The light on the hull was not white. It pulsed in layers like a heartbeat, in colors that wanted to be named but refused every word. He reached with a hand that still smelled of motor oil, and for the first time in a life that had been measured in lug nuts, something looked back. The object opened along a seam like a shell, and a presence stepped into the moon. And the presence was small and not what the movies prepare you for. The being had fingers that moved like brushes and eyes that seemed to read the air. It did not speak in words at first. It conveyed patience and need. It breathed in a sequence that matched the light. And when Ethan found his voice, he said what any human would say. Then, "Who are you?" The being tilted its head, and in a voice that sounded like a bell beneath water, it said, "Please help." That first exchange was a fracture the world had not anticipated. Around them, the wind moved through wiregrass and a coyote called, and the stars were clean witnesses. Two farmers across the county later swore they saw a column of light drift up, and the town pastor later said it looked like a comet. But for Ethan, the moment narrowed to an ask and a pair of hands that could be put to work. He listened to the being, and in its rhythm he heard a structure like speech and meaning layered on top of sound like lace. He flattened his palms, and the being touched them, and the touch warmed and left a mark that looked like a flash of copper on the skin for a few seconds. He took a breath and made the choice that would change his life. He would tow the craft home before the sheriff or the scientists arrived. The encounter that followed was part dialogue and part communion and lasted longer than a single night. The being began to speak clearer as Ethan worked, and he learned to hold language like a delicate tool. "My name is Iru," it said in those bell tones, and the syllables felt like stones dropping into water. "We are not gods and we are not demons. We are travelers of frequency." Ethan said, "I am Ethan Cole." He said, "I fix things." Iru said, "Your hands can hear the difference." They established a vocabulary. Over the next exchange, their conversation stretched into the long negotiation between cultures where meaning folds into metaphor. "Why me?" Ethan asked. "Because you were present and because you listen without immediate belief," Iru answered. "Because you have been taught to repair and not to judge what repairs." Ethan laughed once and made a joke about oil and cosmic engines. Iru did not laugh, but it released a ripple of light that felt like amusement. He offered no miracles, only cooperation and small safe instructions.
The first 10 exchanges were raw and practical. Ethan asked about origin, about intent, about whether leaving it on his property was dangerous. Iru explained that its power core had damped due to environmental interference and required mechanical alignment and a receptor to reharmonize with ambient consciousness. Ambient consciousness, Ethan repeated, the phrase sticking in his mouth like engine grease. You mean mind? He asked. We mean resonance between intent and field, Iru corrected. At one point, Ethan asked about Jesus, and Iru's light changed in a way that felt like an exhale. We know of him, it said, and then paused. We hold records of many who tuned frequency to heal and to teach. He is a pattern in many records. Ethan felt his chest tighten, and the air around them tasted like iron. That first dialogic morning ended with the being asking for a small favor. Would Ethan bring it into the shed?
Let it be worked on. Because exposure to the sky confused its systems. Ethan faced a decision that could be read as moral or foolish. He weighed the sheriff's potential reaction, the neighbors, the idea of becoming the person who had hidden an impossible thing. His backstory helped him choose. He had been born to a line of people who had been practical in private. His father Miguel had taught him to take the hard job because it kept shame small. His mother Rosa had taught him to listen for the sound people did not make. He had left church in his early 20s after watching a funeral in which prayers felt like mechanical motions and the pastor's words fell on a family that needed a plan. He believed in repair, not revival. He had been awake 3 nights when he decided. He lifted the ship with a borrowed strap and a truck whose shocks were tired, and his friend Luis Martinez, who had a farm and a broad heart, drove the tow. Maria Rivera, the neighbor, offered blankets and then food without asking questions. And Sheriff Tom came once to check the property and left with a look that suggested he had seen a thing he could not name. This backstory filled the man with reasons, both practical and tender, to move the ship into his shed and to bring Iru to safety. The choice was not grand. It was the accumulation of years and learned modesty. For Ethan, that was enough. He did what he knew how to do, which was to make a space where something fragile could be touched and learned. The days that followed were a small epic. They consisted of hands and metal and interrupted sleep. Ethan created a workspace under a single bare lamp. The metal sang at a frequency that answered the lamp in harmonics. The sensory life of the repair was thick with detail. The smell of solder and motor oil, the taste of dust in the back of the throat, the feel of warm metal against skin, the sound of a hum that shifted like a tide, the sight of small points of light arranging themselves into patterns. Ethan and Iru developed a method of work that mixed language and gesture. Ethan would describe a part, and Iru would supply a modulation of light that suggested alteration. They spoke aloud during these technical exchanges, and their dialogue became the living manual. If you file this ridge down 2 degrees and reseat the receptor, you will reduce the jitter, Iru would say. Ethan would reply with a comment about tolerances, and the two of them would argue gently about what counted as safe. The secondary characters moved through the shed like witnesses. Dr. Chen, an electrical engineer from the State University, who arrived with cautious eyes and smell of coffee, offered technical probes and asked questions about measurements. Ellie Rivera, the neighbor's daughter, brought sandwiches and a kindness that felt like sunlight. Marcus Hale, a trucker friend, brought an old generator. Reverend Susan from the town church came once and sat near the door and watched with a face that did not fully betray fear or wonder. These 5 figures provided different reflexes of the community: curiosity, fear, faith, skepticism, compassion. Dialogue with them was longer and more human. There was a scene where Pastor Allen visited and sat opposite Ethan. "You are playing with forces you do not understand," he said. "And what do you understand?" Ethan replied. "I understand my hands. I understand that when a thing is broken, you can ignore it, or you can fix it. Faith did not tell me to ignore it." Pastor Allen pressed his lips.
The conversation cycled through 10 exchanges that measured the distance between a pulpit and a workbench. The technical details of the repair are important to mention in plain terms so that the work feels credible. Ethan reprovisioned the receptor dank by carefully removing a scoring plate, then aligning 3 resonant filaments within a tolerance of 1/10 of a millimeter. He used an oscilloscope to map the incoming frequency and matched it with a quartz crystal he had tuned with a small coil. The crystal acted as a phase stabilizer, reframing chaotic harmonics into a steady carrier. This process required patient iteration, measuring a waveform and gently altering coupling until the noise floor dropped and the core initiated a low hum that meant the system had returned to baseline. While working, they developed lessons. Iru was not interested in arguing theology. Its currency was demonstration. It showed Ethan records that were not pictures and not words, but sequences of memory that he perceived as a sensation when it touched his temples. One such memory was a day in a city filled with bodies that a man had walked through and turned attention into healing. Ethan felt the memory like a warm wind, and intolerance burned in his chest, because for a moment, the image of the man he had called Jesus was freed from church painting, from doctrine, and became instead a pattern, teaching others how to attune their attention to pain and thereby shift it. Iru explained that Jesus was part of a lineage of people who had discovered that human attention tuned to a certain frequency could reorder physiology and social bonds. When Ethan asked whether this diminished the sacred, the being's light slowed, and it said no. Instead, it broadened the sacred into a technique and an ethic. The revelation both made him giddy and made him recoil, because it suggested that prayer could be twice-thing ritual and a precise technology of alignment. They tested the teaching with an experiment that was simple and sharp. A woman in town named Anna had chronic tremors that had been marginally helped by medicine, but not cured. She agreed to sit in the shed holding the quartz crystal while Ethan and Iru guided her attention.
The procedure was practical and humane. Ethan instructed Anna to focus on the crystal, then to breathe in a pattern. Iru suggested the pattern had 4 counts in and 3 counts out. Then hold a soft image in mind of a place where pain loosened. The room smelled of tea and metal and old wood. The sensory detail was precise. The rubber of the chair squeaked under Anna's weight. The light of the lamp reflected in specks on her hair. The crystal felt cool on her palm, and there was a faint electrical taste on the tongue. After 20 minutes, the tremors reduced by half and for a brief period stopped. The data felt both miraculous and empirical. Dr. Chen took notes and measured muscle activity and found a reduction in tremor amplitude consistent with altered motor cortex excitability. The experiment was repeated and again showed measurable change. The group observed the change, and some laughed with relief, and some covered their mouths with hands that tried to keep from trembling. When the results were clear, Ethan felt something inside of him move like a gear into a new position. The promise of transformation had a texture and a weight. Around this point in the narrative, I need to ask you to participate. Did you feel the tension in that experiment? If you have ever tried to focus your attention and change the way you feel, start your comment with, "I have tried," and then tell us what worked or did not work for you. Tell us if you have ever believed that prayer was only faith and not technique. Share one sentence about a moment when something unexpected opened up for you. Your response matters more than you think, because stories like this spread by testimony and by trial and by the courage of neighbors. Comment now and help shape what comes next. The protagonist of this story will read selections, and we will address community examples in future episodes. The revelation that followed the experiments was not tidy. It arrived in layers and created tension because knowledge carried responsibility. The first major moment of tension came when word reached Sheriff Tom, and he returned with more than questions. He came with a team from a nearby lab and a warrant. Ethan had to decide whether to reveal the full scope of what had happened or to protect the being and the method. The scene where Sheriff Tom and Dr. Chen and Ethan argued had intensity like heat in the palms.
"We can take the device for study," the sheriff said, and his words were practiced, polite law. "If you take it, you may never put it back together," Ethan answered. And between them sat the question of ownership. Who owns a technology that reconfigures mind? Marcus spoke up in favor of protecting the being because he had seen the change in Anna and because he trusted Ethan. The dispute lasted 300 minutes in emotion, and it felt like a negotiation between legal structure and emergent morality. Ethan decided to refuse full custody and instead offered limited access for measurement under strict conditions. The sheriff left with a promise he did not believe he would keep. That moment cost Ethan sleep and increased the angle of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. The second tension arrived as a moral crisis when the technique they had used spread. A man named Javier, who had been marginally aggressive, found that with resonance he could quell his rage, and then used a similar method in a fight to calm his opponent. The result was good. His neighbor was not hurt, but the method became a tool, and with tools come temptations. Ethan wrestled with whether giving people a method to alter emotion without community scaffolding was ethical. He argued with Iru about autonomy and consent for hours. "You teach them the protocol without their context, and they will use it to manipulate," Ethan said. Iru replied that knowledge can be misused, and that misuse had to be met with governance. They sketched a simple code of practice that prioritized consent and community witnessing. The tension here was practical and moral, and consumed pages of nights where Ethan dreamed of being both healer and jailer. That pressure was a second moment of fracture. The third major tension was internal and deeper. As the reinterpreted story of Jesus circulated, some accused Ethan of desecrating tradition by telling a different truth. A group led by Reverend Susan protested at the town square, and Pastor Allen publicly questioned the work. Ethan fielded accusations of sacrilege and was called both blasphemer and prophet in different messages. The internal debate that followed him was painful because he had once left church and now found himself called back into a public theology. He worried that he had replaced belief with technique, and that in doing so, he had undermined the meaning others held sacred. He went to the shed and asked Iru if truth could be both a tool and a mystery. Iru answered in a voice that sounded like rain on tin. It said, "Truth is a pattern that can be observed and also an experience that asks surrender." That paradox did not settle his fear, but it offered a frame to continue. The central revelation of the narrative centers on reinterpretation. Iru provided a record that suggested Jesus was a master of tuning attention, a pattern teacher among others who had passed through records in different regions. The rereading did not say that the person was fictional or less divine. It suggested that historic accounts captured people who learned to align intention with field, and in doing so, altered human bodies and social ties. This idea reframed miracles as disciplined phenomena, in which attention served as the operator. Ethan learned that the stories in the Bible were human accounts filtered through language, and that the core of those stories could be taught as a repeatable practice. The being presented sequences that corresponded to parables not as moral stories only, but as instructions on how to orient mind toward compassion. When Ethan asked whether this diminishes faith, Iru answered, "No, faith becomes choice, not accident." They demonstrated the claim with a second experiment that was both spiritual and demonstrable. They invited a small group of volunteers and ran a guided session where breath pattern and focused imagery were combined with a tuned crystal. The group reported changes in pain, anxiety, and social connectedness, and measurements suggested alterations in heart rate variability consistent with enhanced parasympathetic tone. The protocol was specific and repeatable. The effect was small but consistent. The conversation after the experiment produced 12 exchanges among the core group, where questions about responsibility, access, and teaching were hashed out. Dr. Chen insisted on peer review and on publishing cautious results. Maria insisted on teaching the method to her youth group with safeguards. Sheriff Tom asked for guidelines about public use. Ethan asked whether to teach widely or to keep it contained. The debate produced a community pact. They would form a small council with diverse representation to oversee dissemination. That decision relieved some pressure and increased other responsibilities. The climax of the story was a vision that occurred one midnight when the machine hummed at a frequency that matched Iru's resonance and sent a field through the shed into Ethan's chest. He experienced a download of pattern and story for a duration that felt like both a breath and a lifetime. In the vision, he walked through salt flats, and a man stood at a well, and the man spoke in phrases that were at once ancient and operational. The voice said, "Attend to the neighbor as you would tune a string." The vision conveyed the feeling of connection between small acts and large changes. When the experience ended, Iru said it was a transfer of a fragment of network memory, a teaching packet that could be used to train attention. Ethan wept because it was both intimate and terrifying. The being told him it could not stay long, its environment required repair, and it had a duty to travel. Iru offered Ethan a small object, a crystal that had been tuned to the pattern as a tool and as a promise. It explained how to use it, and then it left under a sky that took on a notch of silence. The light left behind tasted like citrus and metal, and the shed smelled for a long time of something like departure. After the departure, there were consequences. The council published preliminary methods, and Dr. Chen formatted a careful paper. Some religious leaders accepted a reinterpretation that enriched their practice and integrated technique into service. Others rejected it and called for censure. Anna, who had been helped, became a local advocate for community healing. Lewis set up a community workshop and taught neighbors how to listen to their bodies. Ellie organized a group to support
People who had adverse responses. Marcus opened his generator company to fund the first community center. Sheriff Tom created a protocol for responding to requests for assistance. Reverend Susan and Pastor Allen hosted a forum. The town changed in small but persistent ways. More people reported better sleep, lower levels of neighbor conflict, and increased volunteerism. The effect was messy and human and not uniformly good, but it was real. 1 month later, Ethan found that his hands shook less when he closed the shed door and that his sleep pattern had gentled. The first month saw 7 families trying the method under council supervision. Maria reported that her teenage son slept through full nights for the first time in 2 years. Dr. Chen published a short technical brief and submitted requests for controlled trials. The sense in the community was tentative hope, and the crystal remained an object of care. There was grief, too. A small faction had left the church in protest, and some had accused Ethan of hubris. He met with them and listened and did not always have answers. He kept a notebook of the technical parameters that worked and the mistakes that had been made, and he added to that notebook the memorials of each person who had tried the method and the outcome. 3 months later, there was a more organized activity. The council had formalized consent protocols and trained 12 facilitators, including Anna. They had begun a community outreach program that paired participants with mentors and required review meetings. Dr. Chen reported preliminary findings that suggested reproducible effects on stress markers in a controlled sample. The town square hosted a public demonstration where Ethan and Iru's final words were read aloud by Reverend Susan, who had come to a quieter acceptance. People described less isolation, more neighbor helping, and a small drop in reported domestic disputes. The effect radiated into workplaces where employers reported fewer missed days and into classrooms where teachers saw calmer children after short practice sessions. Name by name, the small victories accumulated and the technique found footholds in everyday life. 6 months later, the change had become cultural enough to be visible. The council published an open manual integrating the practice with community ethics and training. A week-long retreat drew participants from 2 neighboring counties, and Marcus Hale funded scholarships for those who could not pay. Dr. Chen partnered with a university to begin more formal studies. The range of people involved had broadened to include a retired nurse named Lorraine, who adapted the practice to accompany palliative care, and a school counselor named Jamal, who used elements of it to help students with test anxiety. Ethan, who had once measured his life and repaired alternators, now measured it in meetings and in bedside visits. He still kept his hands in grease, and he still fixed cars, because practical work kept him grounded. The town was not transformed into a utopia, but habits had shifted and a sense. Agency had spread. People reported more agency over pain, and the community showed lowers in some markers of distress. The crystal remained a talisman and a tool, and it was kept in a public place for anyone to request with a witness and consent.
There were critics and there were failures. Some attempts produced no measurable change, and some people experienced unsettling memory shifts that required counseling. The council published cautionary notes and a registry for adverse events. The balance remained messy, yet the singular claim that had begun as a request for help had produced a pragmatic and spiritual practice. The reinterpretation of Jesus as both a figure and a pattern did not erase devotion. It offered a way to teach people to be instruments of compassion through attention. Ethan learned that truth can arrive as an instruction manual and as a gospel, and that you can hold both without flattening either. In the end, Ethan did not become famous. He continued to open the shop in the mornings and to tighten bolts and to pour coffee for neighbors who stopped by. He taught classes on attention on Thursdays, and on Sundays some people prayed with ritual and some practiced the technique. He learned to live with the tension of being both a repairman and an accidental bridge between worlds. He kept the crystal in a place where anyone could ask for time with it and where anyone could refuse to take part. He understood at last that the greatest responsibility of evidence is to make a way for more hands to be trained to help. If you felt something shift reading this, tell us by starting your comment with "I have tried" and then one sentence about what you learned. If you want to follow this work, subscribe and return. We will publish updates and peer-reviewed notes and community stories. The truth we found was practical and strange, and it invited people to wake up and to act. In a world prone to simple explanations, the better work is often complex and patient and requires us to repair what is broken and to teach others to do the same. Remember that repair begins with attention, and that attention can become a practice that changes bodies and communities and perhaps reshapes how we read the old stories into tools for now. If you are willing to test with care and with consent, come join the conversation and help build the code by which we will use this method. The last light Ethan saw before the shed went quiet was not a goodbye, but an invitation, and the phrase he carried forward was simple: practice can become grace.